It's the Thursday History. That was to the tune of It's a Small World from Disneyland. And the last musical component of this episode today. I can't promise that. Guys, come on. What if I burst into song again? Don't make a liar out of me. Me. But I can promise that it is unlikely. This is a very special monthly history dive into the history of psychology and culture. Because you get the whole episode, no matter who you are, who you be, where you are, where you be. The where you are is already guaranteed into this to not be a barrier. However, the weekly history dive goes out to members of the Patreon, which you can join at patreon.com/brokenbrain, and is one of the bonus things you get. Once a month, though, an entire episode appears here on the main feed. So you can get a little taste, the rest of you. Those who are patrons of the show, of course, you get bonus materials, including videos of all the interviews that are done, and these weekly history lessons in their fullness, as well as some others that are developing, and you can see that at patreon.com. You can also go to dwighthurst.com/support to find other ways that you can support this show. Also, 50% of your monthly donation goes to the charity that was the charity of focus in the month in which you joined. Which, of course, this month is Transcending Barriers Atlanta. TranscendBarriersATL.org is the website that you can go to support, learn about, and share this wonderful nonprofit that works with citizens in Atlanta who are Black transgender individuals and are disproportionately targeted and affected by legal issues of one kind or another. So let's talk a little about logotherapy and Dr. Victor Frankl. This is a look into one example of logotherapy that was shared by Dr. Victor Frankl, who you may or may not be familiar with on a personal or general level. What? He had friends, and I think his friends would be listeners to the show. Write in following this episode and let me know your personal experiences with Dr. Victor Frankl. Now, you may have read his book, or at least his best known book, which is Man's Search for Meaning. A very, very famous book in the world of psychology that talks about the use of his philosophies about finding meaning in suffering and how meaning can make suffering more tolerable. He has a lot of cred when he writes this because he discovered and developed a lot of these principles in the way that he and others survived the concentration camp experience of the Holocaust, something that I fear we don't take as seriously enough nowadays, perhaps not even as seriously as we did a generation ago on the average. I'm speaking here from the U.S., but anyway, something that is always important that we do remember. And if you really do want to know what went on, his book does talk about, there's a memoir, obviously, aspect to it as well, where he talks about how he survived that. He went on to develop a discipline called logotherapy that came from this, and we'll get to that. The very last thing, by the way, so this is great. This is not just a few minute sample, because anyone listening, the very end of this is the point that I was thinking of, which is the actual story that I'll tell. But let me set the stage a little bit. So in his book, like I say, a very memoir-like quality, because he talks about the horrific things that they had to go through, the malnutrition, the torture, the pain, the death. He himself had many, many loved ones who died as well. He was already a practicing doctor and knew about psychoanalysis and psychology and things like that as he went into this experience. So that was very interesting because he had a perspective that allowed him to, he credited it with his survival in many ways, but also was able to help other people. And he noticed that those who were able to find any kind of, whether meaning, any kind of way to reframe their experience could be helpful. Now, let me explain what that means a little bit. It was not a, well, it's all for the best kind of mentality. No, not at all. But looking at the situation and saying, what can we do with it? I think it describes a little bit better his general philosophy, if I'm going to be overly reductive and put it into that one sentence. For example, he talked about how he would picture himself while he was going through experiences. He would narrate the experiences as if he were standing at a lectern, speaking to large groups of people, saying, I have to survive and carry this story forward to lessen the chance that things like this will continue to happen. I need people who weren't there to know the truth about what this is like. And he would put together these lectures in his mind. And interestingly enough, when he would share that story, he was often literally standing where he had hoped to be. And he'd made that into a prediction of sorts that he was able to bring to pass through his work. So that's an example, as is the upcoming story tease, about how he would apply that kind of thing. Frankl himself was Austrian, and his bios and things online you'll find describe him as a psychologist, a philosopher, and a neurologist as well. He was born March 26th, 1905, and lived actually until September 2nd of 1997. So at an age of 92 years old, if you don't feel like doing the math, and you need to know. So one of the things that's very interesting is you can find, fairly current. We're talking, that's 20 years ago now. But did I say 20? Because I meant 30. But you can find fairly modern. He was still giving presentations, lectures, and trainings all the way up until the end of his life. So you can find some things that really, once again, aren't that long ago. Think about it. 30 years ago, a lot of us out here were alive. Some of us were in high school when he died, or just out of, even maybe. And then that's an easy amount for someone who's an adult today to say I was alive then. And you go back in his life to the point where, boy, that was happening. The Holocaust was happening. It's not that long ago. We need to kind of remember that, I think. Now, psychoanalysis was very popular as Frankl was coming up in the world. And I think it's interesting to look at the differences of other forms of psychological therapy and that started to develop based off of that. Psychoanalysis being obviously the work of Sigmund Freud. And so psychoanalysis goes into a lot of analyzation of repressed memories, and the idea being that through talking and talking and talking and talking for a lot of years, that you can understand and possibly even have effect upon the subconscious. The idea being that the subconscious is where basically a lot of our decisions are made for us, and we cannot directly access it really at all. And that a lot of these things come from unresolved conflict with society, with parents, with things such as that. Logotherapy departed from that in a sense of it was looking more into existential philosophy, even a spiritual component, not a specific religious component, but more of a spiritual understanding of life, which made it and was also defined by discovering meaning. There are three things that came across. Frankl talked about three types of ways to discover meaning. He said number one was by creating a work or doing a deed. Number two is by experiencing something or encountering someone. And three, by the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering. So the idea being that if we do something or look at something differently, we can discover a meaning. One might even say create a meaning. And I will say this, in the eyes of this type of therapy, if you're saying I am discovering a pre-existent meaning that is there through either a spiritual sense or position of faith, things like that, or if you believe that I am finding and developing, even inventing perhaps, a meaning that was not there until I found it, made it, whatever. Neither of those is better or worse than the other from a standpoint of psychological health. They're both very, very useful because they are a means to get to a psychologically healthy place, and whichever one works for you, and nobody, especially don't have any beef with either direction. I will say probably, maybe even most commonly, I see that there's a little bit of both, that people are in between those two positions. So anyway, that's just an interesting thing, I think, is that if you find meaning, it doesn't necessarily matter if you've made it, found it, some of both, it's there, and it can help things to become more tolerable. I think importantly is that Frankl did not preach that this will make suffering go away. It does not make you happy all the time or whatever, but it is a survival mechanism that is very effective to even find purpose, because you find purpose when there's meaning if you're doing it. There's a story that I heard from Frankl when he was speaking in a conference. I was not in attendance to that conference. It was previous to 1997. But I heard this recording of it, and this is not the main story, by the way. This is a bonus Jonas story where he said that he'd often been asked if he considered himself a follower of Freud. And they have many, many philosophical differences. But he told this story of being in Austria and walking down the street. And I have no idea how old. I don't remember that part. But how as he was walking down the street, he saw Sigmund Freud down the street walking. And as it just turned out, Sigmund Freud made a lot of the turns and was headed to some location that was somewhere near wherever Frankl was headed. And so he said, for that amount of time, for that 20-minute period or whatever, I was literally a follower of Freud. So, he's a rascal too, apparently, from his storytelling. So that's kind of fun. And then I believe he snapped a few pictures, sold them to TMZ, and, made a fortune. That's the last part of the story might be a little suspect. Maybe I made that part up. But you know what? Whether I made it up or discovered it as a pre-existent, that really isn't important. It still helps. Another interesting important difference, I should say, between psychoanalysis and logotherapy is the concept of free will. There's a lot of disciplines, by the way, behaviorism, psychoanalysis. There's a lot of psychological outlooks that say that our own agency or freedom of will is basically non-existent. I find most people look at things within a series of a context of actions and influence, but frankly, I find that most people that I've encountered believe in some degree of free will because we have a conscious awareness of making choices. Now, there is some research to indicate that there is actually unconscious or less conscious elements that go into that, and that's why we make pathological choices, and that many times our conscious thought is just trying to justify a decision we have already made. But I think unquestionably we can say that sometimes our conscious thoughts go against something that we were going to do, and we do find ways to stop addictive behaviors and other things that are very, very difficult. So we all have that concept, and I think that's where, just on an experiential level, most people believe in a freedom of choice. Well, this is a very, very highly debated and debatable thing, even more than maybe you think it is. But in logotherapy, Frankl's attitude was that there was freedom of will to find meaning, and also the meaning of life. There's a quote I found from him where he says that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. So that would go back to, I talk about this at DBT thing a lot of times, where there is a sort of a structured hierarchy of choices you can make to deal with a problem. And in DBT, they would say you can fix the problem is the ideal, number one, and obviously we all try to do that. If you can't fix the problem, you move to number two, which is you try to change your outlook or reframe the way that you look at the problem or the way you approach it. And then perhaps you can change your feelings about it based off of that. The third, they would say, is acceptance of an unpleasant fact, acceptance of suffering, that kind of a thing. And logotherapy would take it that next step and say imbuing some kind of meaning to it. Obviously would be a task you could do. And that would be very similar to DBT's acceptance piece, or REBT's acceptance piece, or CBT's acceptance piece, or any of the various philosophies regarding acceptance, or radical acceptance as they call it. Once again, not approval or enjoyment or saying that this even has to be happening for a reason, but imbuing it with some kind of meaning. Meaning is not reason. It doesn't mean that it happened because of it. Oh, yeah, and the last only remaining choice open to us, if we can't fix it, if we can't reframe it, and if we can't or won't decide to accept it, is misery. That's the fourth one on the DBT hierarchy. A not so subtle little mind trick to help us go, well, I don't want to be miserable. Let me go back and try the other three again. So that type of thing. And that acceptance is ultimately the last string of defense or the last ability to minimize misery. The DBT would say, to the degree that you can't accept something, you will be miserable. Now, logotherapy, once again, the thing that I think is powerful about it is it does take it a step beyond that to say, let us use the thing that I'm trying to accept in a way to try to generate maybe some satisfaction or at least appreciation of survival. So that is the root part of logotherapy that I find comes up a lot. So to this question of do we have, freedom of choice, one of the interesting things I find from I have both the interest of a student of psychology and that type of thought process and philosophically approaching things, and as a therapist, very practically approaching things. I find that from a practical perspective, that debate doesn't really often equate to success in a therapeutic setting or not. And I'm not going to say it never does. Existentially, internally, there's lots of things that we go through when we unpack our own issues and things, and that may inspire people one way or another. However, because of the conscious choices that we do make and the fact that we have to engage with those, and it seems if we do engage with them, things sometimes go better in our health and our life, that becomes a moot point from the standpoint of what we are going to do. And so you could say that techniques that focus on doing things and thinking, by the way, and reframing our thoughts is doing something. So when we're focused on that, then, it seems to have an impact. And so from a practical perspective, that debate is not part of whether or not we can improve, is my opinion. So you could say in this instance or in this application, it is a moot point somewhat. Still very interesting and worthy of debate and thought. I believe it makes us a better person to flush out things philosophically, but we are doing something for ourselves psychologically that is different than just surviving, healing, or moving forward. And so there you go. That's my little take on free will, y'all. Shall I tell the actual story? This is something that comes from an introduction to logotherapy. It's often included in when you buy Your Man's Search for Meaning. It's often included in there, so you may have come across this story, but I think it's a dope story for anybody who has not heard it. Frankl talked about working with a man who had lost his wife. She had died, and they would talk about it, and obviously he was working through his grief, through therapy and processing his feelings and how it was affecting his life. And they had been very, very close. And so the mourning was very extreme and getting in the way of just this individual's functioning and his happiness, obviously. And as they were working through, Frankl basically worked with him on this concept of meaning, and just wasn't taking until one day they come across this idea of meaning, which was that, wow, you are providing a service, aren't you, in a way? How would your wife feel if you had passed first? And I believe this came from a question that was proposed by Frankl. And I will say, one of the things about logotherapy is that's a little directive, okay? Y'all know me. I'm very against prescribing meaning for other people. But in the context of this being a therapy session, getting to know each other, having a rapport, I'm willing to give a little benefit of the doubt here to Frankl in this instance. But so at some point he asked, was your wife close to you as well? How would she have felt if you died first? And the man was like, I feel like she'd be very sad, right? Well, it would be similar to what you're experiencing. Yes. How do you feel about her feeling that way? And that was it. That clicked something in this man to say, I'm doing this for her. The only other outcome of death in their relationship would have been for him to go first. No option for them, neither of them to die. And I guess technically you've got the ending of the Notebook where they die at the same time. Spoiler alert, by the way, for the Notebook. But basically, and what is most likely is that one person passes before the other. And this had such an impact on this man because of the affection that he had for her, that this reframed his whole experience to say, the suffering I'm having would be hers if it was not mine. And so while it still hurts, the hurt took on a meaning. And it reminds me of another story that I heard about or read in an article that was being shared about a similar sort of a therapy session where there's an individual who had some violence, a violent attack in their lives, and they were having such a hard time getting past the trauma of that. And over time, they worked on this through therapy until they said in the article that they had someone, a therapist, presumably, ask them, so are you a believer in like divine intervention, or are you just a really tough bastard, or are, what do you attribute to your survival of this kind of thing? Or do you feel like it's just random luck? And it was interesting because playing around with that idea, the idea that, what's the resolution of this question to why did I survive this attack? All of a sudden, that actually made a tremendous, epiphany style impact, to where all of a sudden it felt more tolerable, more manageable, this lingering trauma. Not that it went away necessarily. I didn't get that impression, but the crisis acute nature of it, was quelled by this thought that it's like, something was going on. I did have this worst possible thing happen to me and I made it. I wonder if I should feel safer, and the safeness of having survived. Now, that doesn't work for everyone. Once again, I like that it came from a question rather than a prescription necessarily. Just a question about that perspective. But as we adjust those perspectives, it can be very, very powerful. So there's your little story about Victor Frankl. And I hope that it is interesting to you. I can only presume that if you're still listening, that it is. So thank you to everybody out there for listening. If you are not in a position to be able to donate to Help Their Broken Brain to do well and prosper and all that jazz, then, please consider sharing an episode with someone that hop on over. You're on your phone anyway, probably. Hit the link, copy the link and send it to someone if you would, because that helps us to spread the information. The whole purpose of this is to spread information that hopefully is helpful, brings a little joy, a little interest, and maybe a little added health into our lives. And that would give you meaning in the suffering of listening to me or the joy, hopefully, of listening. And it would be very helpful. Thank you so much again. And everybody, have a great week.